I just want to say a couple things first off. One, why are we here as a church, as a community? A lot of different reasons. For some of us, it's just to find some encouragement this week that we need desperately. For others of us, we're here maybe to celebrate and rejoice. And that's one of the things that the music does. The music helps us kind of reflect on who God is and who we are, and some of it's a celebration, and some of it's more, introspective, helps us look within and think thoughts a little bit more deeply. Part of why we're here is just to be a community, and this is 1 hour, 2 hours, something like that on your Sunday morning, but hopefully you're using this as a springboard to connect with people, maybe on a little bit wider basis. And so maybe this is a time when you plan something with somebody else, have somebody over for dinner, for a game night, or just plan a meetup for a conversation over coffee or meal or something like that. For others of you, you're here to learn something, and hopefully we'll be challenged too, just in our perspective. As John mentioned last week, we're not trying to go the Bible alone. We need each other to approach this. And that's actually kind of what we've been talking about the last few weeks. So if you're just jumping in, maybe you're visiting us because you're traveling through the area, or you're just attending or watching online for the first time, we've been in this series called Rediscovering the Bible, because I feel like as a church community right now, we're at this place where maybe for a lot of you, you've been familiar with the Bible for a lot of years, but I found, thinking about how I've approached the Bible in the past, I had kind of a narrow perspective oftentimes. It's shaped by, our upbringings, how we're taught to read the Bible or discover the Bible. And so how can we expand that? For others of you, this whole searching out the Bible thing is kind of a newer concept that you've just been exploring more recently. And so what are some tips for approaching this book? Because this is an ancient document. And there's a lot of, differences between how the Bible is written and how maybe a current contemporary fiction novel or something like that would be written. So how can we discover the Bible? Last week we talked about the approaches of the Bible and how it's not just a rule book, it's not a moral handbook, it's deeper than that. It's not just a historical account. There are experiences of people with God and with each other, and they're kind of teaching us, and these stories are forming us, and it's a group conversation we're supposed to enter in with each other. And so it's more intricate than that, more complex than that. And so, again, we're just looking at different ways to approach the Bible over the next several weeks together. And what I want to get into this morning a little bit is taking a look at different forms of literature. And there's three main types of literature that make up the Old Testament of the Bible, and a lot of the Bible, but mainly the Old Testament. One is called narratives. Narratives we call them stories, and you might be able to list off famous Bible stories. But these are narratives. We'll talk about that in a moment. There's also poetry. About a third of the Bible is poetry, and we don't realize it always in our modern translations. But poetry is a little bit of a different animal, and so we'll talk about that in the coming weeks as well. And then a lot of it is what I'm going to call speeches, because it has this logical progression of thought, and sometimes it's meant to persuade you of something or inform you of something or challenge your thinking or help you analyze something, and it's these logical comments that are kind of arranged in a framework. And so depending on what you're reading in the Bible, I would say maybe we should approach those things differently. They're communicating to us in different ways, so we're going to explore that a little bit today. And so again, three main types of literature in the Bible. There's a couple other variants that we'll touch on, but mainly narratives or stories, poetry, and speeches in the Bible. And so today we're going to look at a narrative and talk about what that is. Some of this might feel like, for the next 3 or 4 minutes, like a blast to the past to your former English course or something, not trying to take you all there purposefully. But the Bible is literature, so we need to look at some of those realities. So what's a narrative? What's a story? Kind of at its basic, at its heart, a story is characters. And these characters, they're in a specific setting. And in this setting, they're experiencing a series of events. But these events are not random. When you're looking in the Bible, you're not reading a history or just facts of everything written down. Like if you took my life over this last week and you chronicled every day, Jason goes into office and sits and stares at computer. Jason mows lawn. Jason has dinner with group of friends and family. This is a little bit different than that, because you're not getting the entire picture of these different characters' lives. You're getting snapshots, and they've been very intentionally arranged into a plot, into a specific storyline. So you're getting selections from different people's lives. And those are trying to communicate something deeper to you that you can analyze. It's not just a history or a list of somebody's, weeks or months of their lives. It's a little bit different. There's a plot that's involved. And a plot is a storyline. You can see part of Little Red Riding Hood up there in the background. And a plot, it's a character, and they're introduced in a specific setting. And when you open the Bible and you read these different stories, you're going to encounter groups of characters. And they're placed in specific places or time periods into a setting. And then, lo and behold, something that you don't expect arises. It's new, it's unexpected, it creates a sense of maybe conflict in this person's life. And then these problems start arising, and you see your characters navigate these experiences, honestly, much like we have to navigate our lives, because you never know what's coming the next day in life. You might wake up in the morning and something's just not quite normal, or something new arises, or something challenging arises that you never expected. And so when you look at the Bible, there's a lot of similarities to the way that our lives actually flow. We encounter these problems. And then in these plot lines, the conflict eventually in the story, it's resolved, and the characters experience some kind of change, or they learn something about themselves. And sometimes it's positive, and sometimes it's very negative. But you see how they navigate these different situations in life. And that's the basis of how these stories or these narratives in the Bible are arranged. So here's a practical question. How do you tell when the story switches, when the narrative switches? It's a little bit tricky because, as we'll talk about at the very end, there's some layers to this in the Bible. But for the most part, when you get a new set of characters, when you get a new setting, when you get a new plot line, series of events that lead up to this, climax or point of conflict, and then everything is kind of settles out. When those things shift, you're moving on into the next narrative. And so we're going to look for some more things. Before we talk about how to read these narrative portions of the Bible, some tips and tricks for that, I want to show a brief video. The BibleProject puts out a lot of, I feel like, good videos in this subject matter of how to read the Bible. And so I want to give you this, again, because some of you are more visual learners than you are like auditory. And so you'll learn 1,000 times more from a short little video than you would from listening to me for hours. So this is for you. And then we'll talk about some more things as we wrap up how to read biblical narratives after this short video today.
We're learning how to read different types of literature in the Bible. And we're going to start by talking about biblical narrative.
So narratives, in their most basic form, have characters in a setting going through a series of events. And how those events are selected and then arranged by an author, that's called the plot.
A basic plot line begins with a character in her setting. But then something new or unexpected happens, causing problems that lead up to some ultimate conflict, which is then resolved and the character finds herself changed, living in a new normal.
Now, in reading narratives, it's important to understand every scene in the context of its larger plot line. You can make the same story have a totally different message if you ignore where it occurs in the plot. This happens all the time when people read the Bible.
Really?
Yeah, take, for example, the story about Gideon. There's this well-known scene where Gideon's trying to discern whether God will help him win a battle, and he requests a sign from God.
Yeah, Gideon lays a wool fleece on the ground and asks that in the morning the fleece be wet with dew, but the ground totally dry, and God does it.
Now, if you look at this scene just by itself, what is the conflict?
How can Gideon know if he'll succeed?
And the resolution?
Test God, ask for a sign, and find out.
Yeah, and that's how many people actually read this story, and it totally misses the point, because it's ignoring the larger plot line.
Really?
Yeah, so let's start from the beginning, you'll get the context. The story begins with Gideon and the Israelites living in fear because they're oppressed by an invading people, the Midianites.
Got it.
Then there's the call to action. God commissions Gideon to defeat the Midianites and save Israel.
Yeah, this is shaping up to be a good story.
But then Gideon's super hesitant, so he asks God to do this magic trick, a sign, so I can know it's really you talking to me. And God stoops to his level. He gives him a sign by lighting this fire on an altar.
So Gideon's already asked for a sign.
And that's not all. In the next scene, God tells Gideon to tear down an altar to another god, but Gideon's so afraid, he does it at night.
So Gideon's skeptical and also a bit of a coward.
Then we come to the moment where Gideon's about to face the Midianites, and he's still uncertain, so he asks for another sign, the fleece. He says, I want to know if you'll save Israel by my hand.
And God gives him that sign.
And he's still uncertain, so he asks for even one more sign, which is just a variation of the previous sign.
Okay, so Gideon's asking for way too many signs.
Exactly. In the larger context, it's clear the plot conflict is not how can Gideon discern the mysterious will of God. The real conflict is when will this guy get his act together and start trusting God?
Okay, so then what's the resolution?
We have to keep reading. So Gideon gathers this huge army, 30,000 soldiers to fight the Midianites, and God says, no, way too many men. He whittles the army down to 300.
Why would he do that?
Well, Gideon's been testing God, so now God returns the favor. He tells Gideon to arm these 300 soldiers with trumpets and torches, and then surround the Midianites at night and make all this noise in the hills, which sounds ridiculous, but Gideon does it. And the noise scares the Midianites into this frenzy. They start destroying each other in the dark while Gideon looks on safely from the hills.
So this story isn't offering the reader tips for discerning God's will.
No, it's about God's commitment to use weak people with deep flaws to do more than they could have imagined.
Okay, so short scenes, like Gideon and the fleece, are combined with other scenes making up a larger plot line. And tracing the conflict and resolution through the plot helps you see the message the author's trying to get across.
Now, Gideon's story has been set alongside many other stories that are also about these flawed, often questionable leaders called judges. And each of these has its own internal plot line. But then altogether they make up a whole movement of the biblical story, the period of the judges, and that has its own unified plot line.
And there are many movements within the story of the Bible.
Exactly. And all the smaller stories, hundreds of them, they fit within the context of their own movements. And then these movements together make up the building blocks of the grand plotline of the whole story of the Bible.
So no matter where I'm reading in the Bible, I need to pay attention to these different layers of plot so I can read each story in context.
Exactly. The Bible is such a sophisticated piece of literature. And so all these smaller plot lines keep overlapping, building up the tension. And when you back up, you can see how they've all been woven together into the unified story that leads to Jesus.
So here's a couple things. That's a lot of information, especially at the end where it's like, and there's multiple plot levels and multiple layers and all that. And you're like, okay, that's kind of mind-blowing. So let's back up just a little bit. Here's a couple of reasons why narratives are so helpful. Our minds, it's actually been proven through neurobiology that our minds kind of organize information in sets of stories. So you think about your memories and how you remember things, and most likely your mind is very much organized in sets of stories. You remember people and places and events and happenings, not just a catalog of information that always downloads. In fact, there's a neurobiologist, his name is Mark Turner. He's been a former professor at University of Maryland and also at Stanford, and now works with another organization that really analyzes the mind. But he says this: story is the basic principle of how the human mind works. Most of our experience, most of our knowledge, and our thinking is organized as sets of stories. And so if you're looking at the Bible as communication about experiences people have had with God, people are saying, let's organize this event, and God maybe is even saying, let's organize these events as stories, because there's an incredible ability to remember things that are cataloged as stories. That's not all the Bible, but it's almost half of the Bible exists in these stories. Another interesting thing about stories is they help us make sense of our reality. That's why you read stories to children. That's why people sit around campfires and tell stories. You're thinking about how other people live their lives, and it almost forces you to think about how you live your life. So what's happening? Why am I on this rock that's orbiting a ball of hot gas in a vast universe? Why do I have complicated thoughts and emotions? How should I interact with other people? What kinds of decisions should I make in life? The stories of the Bible help us think these larger thoughts, and they're organized as stories. And there are some benefits of biblical narratives and ways to read Bible narratives, and that's what I want to get into a little bit next. First of all, the video touched on this a little bit, but you have to understand scenes in context of the plot, of the whole storyline. There was an example on the video with Gideon about how some people would take one scene from the story of Gideon and say, hey, I want to find out God's will. So I'm going to ask God for a sign. God, if you want me to sell my house tomorrow, then I would like to have 3 offers today. Or, those kinds of things. And we plug that in and we think, well, it worked for Gideon, so surely it will work for me. But to do that is to separate it. It's to separate one piece of a puzzle that forms a picture. If you pull any one of these colors out of the puzzle, you just have a color. But if you put them all together, you have what our minds see as a rainbow, right? You have to see the larger picture. And so scenes have to be understood in the context of the whole plot, the whole story that they're creating. And again, these writers, they're intentionally selecting and arranging scenes from different people's lives and experiences to communicate a message or messages to us. And so it's important to see the big picture of each of the stories in the Bible. And that's something that a lot of times we're not always good at. We're good at, or maybe we've even been taught to pick out small pieces and analyze a few verses at a time. But it's important to see the larger story and the bigger picture. Here's another tricky thing about the Bible. Bible narratives, they lack the details of modern stories. If you read a novel, you might find a chapter or two that's just introducing a character, and they're describing their features, and they're telling you about their life and their backstory and all the events. And everything in the Bible is incredibly stripped down in comparison to this. They lack the details of modern stories. Our detailed storytelling, we inherited from the Greek culture. They kind of embellished their characters and filled in details. But the way that the Bible writers handled this in the ancient Israeli Hebrew tradition of writing, they leave a lot of details left out. Visual descriptions are rarely provided, so you don't know what these characters look like. You can imagine it in your head, but there's no visual description. Another thing that's kind of almost upsetting to many of us is that we don't know a lot about their inner thoughts and their motives. We see their actions, but we're kind of left hanging on what their true motives are in the stories. But when there are details that are given about someone's description, the way they look, almost always those details are very important. So when we see character details, our ears should perk up and we should pay close attention because they probably are really significant. But they lack the details on purpose, intentionally. The way that Bible narratives work as well, they leave a lot of questions unanswered. So you read the Bible and you think, well, what about this? And what about that? The story simply didn't tell me. And this is very intentional. The Bible is inviting you as a reader to come to your own conclusions on things. It's making us do some of the work, most of the work. What messages are the writers trying to communicate by sharing this story? Well, it's not spelled out in as much of our modern writing might be. So we're forced to think through, and that's where talking with other people, as John mentioned last week, is important. We sit down and we discuss this. What do you think this means? That's why we have maybe Bible study groups or living room conversations or dinner table conversations that kind of jump into these Bible events and Bible occurrences, because it's hard. It's not on the surface. What are the characters' true motives? Well, it's not spelled out. What's really good and bad, wise and unwise? It almost forces us to debate because the Bible doesn't spell out, well, this character's actions were bad. Occasionally it does, but many times it leaves that to us as the reader to figure out. But writers in the Bible, they see this as a risk worth taking, because the downside is you can interpret these stories and the meanings of them in ways that the writers never intended. So that's the downside. But the upside is that you're making these discoveries on your own. And when you do, it's going to make an impression and it's going to be meaningful to you because you feel like this is something that you've discovered. So that's the advantage to this kind of storytelling. Also, by doing this, you can read the Bible and you can have different experiences in life. And based on what you're going through in life at the time, you might take different pieces of wisdom away from the story. And so the authors can speak to you going through life as a teenager, or you going through life as a young adult, or you going through life as a retired person in your late 60s. And you can each see something that's maybe targeted toward you in that, because different things will arise based on what you're going through in life at the time. It'll address different life experiences. Also, different explanations can be considered. One thing that I've experienced in the past a lot is sometimes as groups of Christians sitting down talking about the Bible or talking about Jesus, we feel like we have to have all of the right answers. Well, this is exactly what this story is trying to teach me. But in reality, there might be multiple options on the table for interpreting some story in the Bible. And so maybe we need to have a conversation and figure out which explanations or explanation, and sometimes maybe it's more than one possibility, we should consider. And this way, different meanings can be layered as well. Some things might have 2 or 3 different meanings that are communicated through this type of storytelling. Whereas if the author just spelled everything out for you, you'd be like, well, that's pretty direct. I guess I'm supposed to take this thing away and only that thing. But the communication can be broader and can address more and more issues. And also, it forces us as a community to think about these things and then to discuss them as a group. And so that's why church is so important. Other people trying to make sense of the Bible together, because we need each other's perspectives and we need each other's input. And that's very intentional. By leaving out some of the details and leaving out some of the motives and not making all the conclusions, it forces us together to talk out these things together, to make discoveries ourselves. A couple more things. When the Bible tells stories, key words and themes happen over and over again. And so you might see a specific setting, something like Egypt, and it happens in a story over and over and over again. You might see something like chaotic waters, like what you'd read about in Genesis 1. And then you'll read a story in Exodus about Pharaoh and his army and his chariots going through chaotic waters that fell in on them. And then maybe you'll find something later on that will deal with chaotic waters or the waters. And so in different places in the Bible, you encounter different themes or different key words across different narratives. Kind of how it hops around in this picture from building to building. And so as you arrive at these different stories, they're linked, they're connected. And this is intentional as well. The writers want you to see certain patterns and certain themes and certain similarities to link stories together, and maybe even to help you make sense of stories and understand them better. And this gives you additional insights. You'll see repeated words, things like see and take and desire. See, desire, and take. You come across that in the first couple pages of the Bible with Eve and Adam at this tree facing this choice, and they see it, and they want it, they desire it, and they take it. And other places throughout the Bible, you'll see characters seeing things and desiring things and taking things. And it's supposed to connect all these instances, and you're supposed to wonder, is this a good choice or a bad choice? Because the first time I read about characters seeing things and wanting things and taking things, it didn't turn out so well for them. So how's this story going to turn out? Or God speaking on a mountain. There are very specific times where God speaks on a mountain, and many times those things are connected. And so key words link a lot of these stories and these narratives. One more thing that I want to mention this morning. And this was something that the video hinted at as well. But plots exist on multiple levels, in these multiple layers. And so each of these narratives, with specific groups of characters, specific settings, and a specific plot that you work through, and you see events build and then resolve, and the characters change, or they learn something from it, or they work through something, or they fail at something. That's one level, where you have all these narratives, individual stories throughout the Bible. And they all have a plot, they all have something to teach us, they all have something that the writer wants to communicate to us. So the Bible exists on that level, kind of at the surface. But then if you drop down a couple of layers, sometimes entire books have a specific plot line or a similar story, or they're trying to communicate a similar lesson, or the stories all connect, something like Exodus, where you see Israel working through individual encounters and situations, but across a period of time. And so all those stories are connected within a book, or sometimes even a couple of books that are together. And then if you go even deeper, the entire Bible is communicating a storyline of how God made humans to partner with him and rule over this creation, how humanity fell away from that and rebelled against God, and how God started to seek out humanity to bring them near to himself. And over time, people failed over and over again. And God came up with an ultimate solution, sending his son Jesus Christ. And how Jesus was the prototypical, the type of human that humanity never could be, because he was also God in the flesh, according again to the story of the Bible, and how that affects people ever since. And so you have this overall story, this overall narrative throughout the Bible as well. And so there's different levels. But again, over 40% of the Bible exists in these narratives, in these stories. They're not detailed, but it's for a reason, to force us into community, to give us the option of learning more than one thing and more than one truth, and to affect us at different points in time in our lives to teach us different things. And so it's very intentional, but it's a masterful way of presenting information. Next week, we're going to take a step away from this topic just for 1 week. There's a pastor who's going to be planting a church in the south side of St. George. It's going to present his ministry, but in a couple of weeks from now, we'll have one more conversation probably on narratives, a couple of different things to keep our eyes on in that. And then we'll talk about poetry and about these speeches and then move on. But again, we're just trying to rediscover the Bible in different ways and be better readers and take less things out of the context that it's given in, have a better understanding of the Bible when we do engage with it. Because it's very intentional and it's communicating specific messages, but they're not on the surface. We have to dig, we have to discover, we have to work together to find these things. But we also have to be careful, because there's a lot of room for misunderstanding if we just isolate very, very specific instances from the whole story. So that's the takeaway from today, and hopefully these kind of tips will be helpful as you pull out your own Bible and you engage the stories. And throughout this week, if you read a specific story in the Bible, think of it in terms of the larger plot it's communicating. Think about what the message is, again, that the writer's trying to communicate, and see it as a whole instead of isolated verses or instances. So again, just trying to be more informed as we deal with the Bible personally.